Hi, everybody. This is Rachel Schwam. I'm the acting director of the Rutgers Energy Institute for the spring 2021 semester. And thanks for everybody for showing up this pretty chilly Friday morning if you're anywhere near anywhere kind of in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic. But this is for those of you who don't know, this is our speaker series that we have generally at this time on Friday, though you'll see once in a while it kind of moves around based on the scheduling of our speakers. And I'd like to introduce Kevin Keys, who is our graduate student administrative person who has set up basically all the logistics in this great speaker series for this spring semester. And so you can see up on the screen, we have some really good people coming. Some of them are folks from Rutgers, such as David Hughes and in anthropology. And then others are Jacqueline Berger, who does applied work in consulting in New Jersey. Will Burns, who does work on carbon capture and sequestration and the kind of legal governance work there, and Gabriel Chan on community solar. So we have a great series. We're still working on adding a couple, and so keep your eyes out for some updates on those. But today I'd like to now toss this over to Dr. Joe Brody, who introduced us and brought us to Dr. Alison Bates for her talk on wind. And so Joe, go ahead and take that introduction away.
Thanks, Rachel. So good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us on the first seminar of the semester. So it's my pleasure to introduce my friend, colleague, and former grad school classmate, Dr. Alison Bates, who is an assistant professor at Colby College. And she has over 15 years of experience in conservation planning, energy policy, and analysis of the social acceptance of energy systems. And she currently focuses on establishing a just energy transition by means of prioritizing communities who typically have less political power to make sure that they are included as part of that decision-making process around energy. She has a PhD at the University of Delaware, which is where I met her. We actually graduated the same year. This morning I actually have a photo of the two of us right at graduation. So it's true, we did work together. Prior to grad school, she spent a decade roughly out on the West Coast working in forest management in California. She's also worked at Senator Chris Coons' office in Delaware. I think you said that was during grad school you did that, Allison. And then after that, she went to UMass Amherst, where she worked with the Wind Energy Center there before starting at Colby this past fall. So with that, Allison, please take it away.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Nice to see, I see some faces, so hello. Really glad to be joining you today. I'm calling in from central Maine, where I've got wind, snow, and ice blowing sideways out my window, and I've lost my internet connection a couple of times. So if I all of a sudden drop out, I will come back in. But it's very chilly up here. So, thanks for taking the time. I'm sure we're all calling in from our cozy homes. So I'm really excited to talk to you today about some of my research. And I guess with that, I'll go ahead and do go ahead and share my screen. Thumbs up. Can people see this? Awesome. Great. So Joe, told you a little bit about myself. I'm an assistant professor up here at Colby College, although I've just recently come from UMass Amherst, where I was a faculty member working with the Wind Energy Center. It's primarily an engineering program, and I was working on sort of incorporating the social components to wind energy planning, and very much focused on the offshore wind industry. That's really what I care most about. I've worked on sort of marine issues and marine conservation really most of my life. I grew up boating in the Gulf of Maine with my family, and that's really it's sort of a labor of love for me. Very happy to be up working in Maine, where if any of you are following the offshore wind industry, you know that Maine is sort of one of the next kind of hotspots for offshore wind development for sort of floating wind turbines. And issues with communities and fishing are really hot topics. So I've really been excited to get to learn some of that. But most of you are in the Mid-Atlantic, so I thought I would talk about some of the work that I've done in the Mid-Atlantic, and then maybe pivot to what some of the next steps are. So as Joe said, I'm really looking at different communities and how communities might be impacted from emerging industry uses in the ocean. Of course, that being offshore wind is sort of the big one that's on its way. In other work, I focus on sort of equity in the overall energy transition. We're certainly looking at net zero by 2050 as sort of the goal, both before the new Biden administration's plan, and certainly with a stronger focus on that now. And offshore wind is very likely to play a big role in that in the United States. And that presents all sorts of both challenges and opportunities. And I'm going to talk about some of the work that I do in helping advance that forward. So I don't need to belabor this point. Everyone in this seminar is well aware that the electricity sector is where we've focused a lot. There's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, and one of the easiest ways to target climate action plans, because we have the technology to move this forward. It's complicated, but we certainly have opportunity to move in the right direction towards net zero by transforming our electricity sector off of coal, natural gas, and oil, and into some of the renewables. So it's very exciting to see both land-based and offshore wind playing a role in that. If you haven't seen this map before, I'll just take a moment describing it. This is a wind speed map. These are produced regularly by the National Renewable Energy Lab. And what this is showing us is that wind speeds are really good over the ocean, right? So 80 meters, that denotes sort of hub height for a large scale wind turbine. So up at 80 meters where the wind turbines are actually spinning, how windy is it? Can we actually generate a lot of electricity? And yes, we can. So in the Midwest, land-based wind is really where we've seen a lot of the wind development in the US. But unfortunately, this is not where we have our population centers, right? We don't really want to run transmission lines. We have a lot of line losses. Our population centers are really coastal in the US. More than 50% of the US population lives within 50 miles of the coast. Anything in sort of the purple, red, blue, kind of the dark areas on this map show wind speeds that are commercially viable, right? It's worth developing sort of large scale wind projects. So we see in the Gulf of Maine, the whole Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, as really being good locations for offshore wind because it's quite windy, right? So really for the last probably 10 to 15 years, there's been an interest in developing offshore wind in the United States, but it's been really slow to start. Right? There are some barriers that we're up against. We often cite cost as one of the major barriers for offshore wind, and in the past it has been. Cost has come way down over really even just the last 2 to 3 years. Costs have dropped significantly. There's a number of reasons for that: technological advances, kind of market certainty and competition. But we know that costs are not the barrier that they once were. We also tend to cite technology as a barrier. What you see here is a map, or not a map, an image showing some different types of wind turbine foundations. Essentially what we've seen in the European industry is kind of these monopile foundations, which are on sort of the left-hand side. It's essentially a giant steel pole that's been hammered into the seabed. And these tend to be best in shallower waters. But as we're looking to develop wind farther from shore, in part to access higher wind speeds, in part to sort of mitigate some of the user conflicts, we're looking at some other technology types, like a jacket foundation, which you see here in transitional waters, or even floating turbine foundations out in deeper waters. We're certainly going to see floating wind in the Gulf of Maine. There's lots of different technology designs, but technology, again, is not the barrier that it once were, but can sometimes be cited as one of our barriers to deployment. Environmental impacts, we hear about issues within threatened and endangered species, whether it's marine mammals like North Atlantic right whales that are migrating, or some of our endangered birds or bats that may come in contact with wind. There's certainly a concern there, and that can slow down the environmental review process. But I really think that it's both the regulatory and the social hurdles that have been barriers to this industry taking off in the US. You know, right now we have one, I guess you could call it commercial scale wind farm off of Block Island that's been in operation for just a couple of years now. And then recently off of Virginia, we've had 2 turbines that were constructed. And that was just this fall. So this has been a very slow to start industry. There's been a lot of uncertainty about the regulatory process because there have been changes that were made over the last 10 to 15 years in sort of how and who was responsible for permitting. That's largely been streamlined now, but it did take, there's sort of some fits and starts, and some of the uncertainty led to maybe some higher costs and difficulty in securing financing from the larger banks. But then we have some of the social barriers. And I think that these are really the key to the puzzle, right? Is understanding and figuring out these pieces. And I'm not going to claim today to have solved sort of the social barriers, but I do think that these are largely the issues that we see coming up over and over again. If you're, reading the newspaper, what the big concerns are. They're really around the social issues, whether it's public perceptions or impacts to certain communities. So when we think about sort of planning and how we might move the offshore wind industry forward, marine spatial planning is sort of a concept that is sometimes used. And this is really a framework where we're balancing ocean uses and users. So what already exists out in the ocean and where is it taking place? And you can use this as sort of a process where you bring people together and identify what the major ocean uses are. And you can also use this as an outcome where you not only produce sort of maps which identify what's happening and where, but also what the use priority might be. Okay. We tend not to do that here in the United States. We've had marine spatial planning that was conducted here in the US under the Obama administration. We had the National Ocean Policy in 2010. That was done by executive order, and it established regional planning bodies. One of those was in the Mid-Atlantic. Some of you may have participated in that. And there was an ocean action plan that resulted. The Trump administration, as an executive order, overturned that and implemented their own executive order, which really focused on state level efforts, but it hasn't really eliminated sort of the regional collaboration around thinking about future ocean uses. And certainly, both in the Mid-Atlantic and in the Northeast, which were sort of the first 2 regions to move forward with marine spatial planning in the US, where offshore wind was sort of a major impetus for an upcoming and emerging use, and how do we consider these this industry in light of all the other activity that's taking place in the ocean. So it's sort of a framework that we sometimes can use. For those of you that haven't looked at offshore wind in the past, I wanted to share this. This is produced by BOEM, or the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. This is the regulatory agency at the federal level that would be in charge of sort of the permitting process. So they would be issuing leases for private industry to come in and have access and basically gain the rights to develop an offshore wind farm. So you can see the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Southeast in this map. And all of the different colors represent a lease area. So it's a collection, a kind of a grid of ocean space that's been secured by one or more developers. Right? So you can see that really the hotspots right now for development are taking place off of the coast of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and then in the mid-Atlantic off of New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland. It's really where most of the focus has been. Not as much in the Southeast because the wind speeds aren't quite as strong. Right? So we haven't seen as much interest yet. Emerging areas, of course, could be the Gulf of Maine and possibly more of the Southeast. So this is meant to just give you a sense of, okay, these are the locations that the wind industry has shown interest in. So how does that fit into the existing ocean users and sort of marine spatial planning? That's what I sort of wanted to delve into. I also wanted to zoom in on one of these maps. This is off of Massachusetts, Rhode Island. These are some of the what we call the wind energy areas. And I just wanted to draw your attention to this little corridor between sort of the blue and the brown lease areas. When these areas were initially proposed, it was identified that kind of that whole region, that there wasn't really this sort of gap in a leased area, that whole region would be, potentially up for leasing. And this is one of the first times we saw some strong opposition from the commercial fishing industry, because that's a really important area for fishing vessels for navigation and transit. And those areas were subsequently removed from leasing from the federal government. So this is just some of the kind of early indicators that the conflicts between offshore wind and commercial fishing were going to be very important in this puzzle. And indeed, these continue to be some of the larger challenges that we're addressing today. So this leads me to what I've been really interested in as we're in some of my research. As the ocean is increasingly crowded and uses have basically evolved in an organic way, right, without spatial allocation of who has access to what, how do we then develop low carbon energy in a way that considers equity to existing ocean users? Right, so how do we do this in a way that if we're not going to allocate ocean space, you go here and you go here, how do we move the industry forward in a more equitable way? So in this project, our goal is to really inform future siting by minimizing conflicts between commercial fishing and offshore wind. And our primary objectives are to identify areas that may be developed for wind based on levelized cost of energy. So what are the best wind spots, right? Then to identify areas of high value to the fishing industry. So where is fishing taking place? How do they interact, right? So just looking at where they take place doesn't really tell us that much, but if we can start to build models where we account for each of those in the same location, then maybe we can come up with better decision making, right? So how do we look at the spatial conflict and coexistence to try to classify areas that might be best suited for future development? And then finally, to incorporate the views of fishers to contextualize what the next steps should be. So I'll share some of the results of a project that's sort of an ongoing project and talk about, what we might do next, and then I'll be happy to take any questions that you may have. So the framing for this started out in this marine spatial planning framework, but we're really starting with just looking at 2 uses at a time, although ultimately you'd really want to look at all the ocean uses together. It just gets very complex very quickly. So we started out by looking at 2 ocean uses that have the potentially very large economic gains or losses. Okay, so that's where sort of wind and fishing, they potentially have spatial conflict and are very large industries. We know the fishing industry in the Mid-Atlantic is quite large. NOAA maintains databases. We're looking at what the total value is. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry in the Mid-Atlantic. We know that there could be impacts to fish species themselves, and we know there may be spatial conflict, meaning the fishing community wants to use the same area that the wind industry may want to use. Right? So how do we minimize some of those? And just sort of a primer, when I mentioned that we're concerned about the environmental impacts on fish themselves, I would say there's less certainty about what these impacts are, although you'll sometimes see this denoted as a concern of the fishing industry. So first, we're looking at what we call EMF, or electromagnetic fields, and how they may impact the fish species that we catch themselves. So there is some uncertainty, I guess, about some of our commercially valuable species and how they may be impacted from the installation of wind turbines or their associated infrastructure, like the cables that bring the electricity back to shore. The electricity cables have electromagnetic fields. They're shielded, but they still have an EM field. There are some species like sharks and rays that are electromagnetic sensitive, so they may be impacted, right? So there's a concern about that. If we have these kind of large cable networks that are on the seafloor. And we're also introducing kind of a hard substrate. So that we see colonization, meaning fish larvae are going to settle on hard substrate. It becomes a habitat. This was something that we call the artificial reef effect. The recreational fishers tend to really like this because it tends to attract different fish species. But this is not necessarily a benefit to the commercial fishing industry because it could change the balance of the ecosystem. You may have different species colonizing than what would normally be there. So you're just sort of changing the ocean environment. So these are just some of the concerns that come up of, what is this going to look like? If we have 5 turbines in the ocean, that's one thing. If we have 2,000 turbines in the mid-Atlantic, well, that's something else if we don't understand these issues well. So there's certainly ongoing research around fish, and there may be some people here that are working on that issue and would love to learn more. We also know that public perceptions around fisheries and offshore wind are important. A study that I did in New Jersey a few years ago actually identified that coastal residents, especially pertaining to the Fisherman's Energy Project, which was a proposed wind farm off of Atlantic City several years ago that did not materialize. But residents around sort of southern New Jersey, Atlantic City, were really concerned about impacts to the fishing industry from the development of wind farms. In fact, this was one of the most important aspects that people had cited in a survey of a couple thousand residents. So we know that there's kind of public concern. These are non-fishers, right? These are just people that live in coastal areas. So we know that there's kind of a public opinion issue, and public opinion certainly can play a very strong role in whether or not we're seeing the wind industry move forward. So that's something to consider. But then we'll bring it to, well, how is the fishing industry themselves sort of impacted? And I think really the big issue, if you follow the newspapers or any of the industry notices or anything that's sort of coming up, is this issue of exclusion. Okay, now in some of the European wind farms, there was exclusion of fishing from within the footprint of a wind farm, meaning multiple turbines together. That was largely done to balance sort of some habitat objectives with sort of some climate goals. That is not going to happen. It's been made very clear that that's not going to happen here in the United States. There's not going to be this prohibition of fishing within and around wind farms here in the US. The big concern is really this, what we call de facto exclusion, where depending on the type of fishing vessel you have, you may not be able to safely navigate through a wind farm. Okay, wind turbines are about 1 kilometer apart. That can change, right? They can be farther apart. Costs go up because the electricity cables have to connect the turbines together, but they tend to be about 1 kilometer apart. And some vessels cannot safely navigate through those or actively fish, right? You have some vessels that operate in what we call pair trawls, where you have 2 vessels that may have very large fishing net in between them, and they're sort of towing at the same time. Or you may have a very large turn radius of a larger fishing vessel. This really varies depending on the industry. So we often talk about commercial fisheries as one sort of entity, but they're not monolithic, right? There's different industries and they have different gear, different vessels, different ownership structures, different economics. But this concept of a de facto exclusion is pervasive, right? This is a big concern. Whether or not it becomes a reality, it's a big concern. There could be insurance restrictions. These are all things that are coming up in the conversation. And we know that we're concerned because if we displace fishers, whether it's because they can't navigate or they choose not to navigate through where a wind farm is, they're incurring costs from increased fishing effort, meaning they're spending more time on the water, okay? Fuel costs, labor costs that go up, or potentially lower catch and that could result in reduced revenue. So then you're seeing some potentially economic effects. So these are some of the concerns that have been coming up between these two industries for at least a decade, right? Concerns around these issues, but they haven't gone away. In fact, if anything, they've become more and more prevalent over the last 10 years. So just to give you a sense, I had mentioned that each of the fisheries are not monolithic. The different gear is used in different fisheries. There's probably some people who work on fisheries on this call, so you're more than familiar with this. But if you're not, you can have small vessels that are throwing out crab pots or lobster traps, compared with very large vessels that are towing really big equipment, kind of trawling equipment behind them, right? So they're going to be impacted in different ways, and we need to look at these kind of by sector if we want to make meaningful conclusions about the interactions between the two industries. So in this project, we're looking at sort of a three-step process where we first say, okay, what are the best areas for wind? And I develop a levelized cost of energy model based on variable costs, right? Things that change spatially. Then we look at where the fisheries are, and then we try to put those together. Okay, so first, in this project, our study area is really the Mid-Atlantic. As you can see here, with a unit of analysis being an OCS or Outer Continental Shelf lease block. Okay, those are about 5 kilometers by 5 kilometers, roughly. So we're developing the net present value on variable LCOE. So it's sort of a different take on the LCOE model. So ultimately, we're coming up with a cost per unit energy averaged across 25 years, right? So an average cost per unit energy. And we're only using inputs that are variable by either, by space, I guess. So it could be bathymetry, it could be wind speed, right? Because that changes north to south. Could be distance from the grid or distance from shore. We've got vessels that are, transiting. They may have longer steam time, or you might need longer cables to connect back to the grid. So these are some of the assumptions. We only look out to 60 meters, so we're sticking with sort of transitional waters, not out into floating waters where you might need floating wind turbines. Using the turbine that you see here, it's a 5 megawatt. By today's standards, it's actually a pretty small turbine. We use this because there's published data about it. And kind of a base nameplate capacity of 500 megawatts. So that's just assuming basically a, large but not overly large wind farm, right? And then in the model, we implement a discount rate of 7%. And so this is what the cost model looks like. You're basically just developing cost per unit energy, where in years 1 and 2, you have capital investments and construction, then have 25 years of operations and maintenance, and then lifetime energy production, 2 years of decommissioning. And again, we're developing variable costs here. So some of the inputs, I'm not going to go into detail on all of these, but just to sort of show you how variable costs play a role in the cost of energy in the ocean. So one of them is in foundations. As you get into deeper water, you need more steel. So we're using a jacket foundation where you're having to use more steel as you get into deeper water. So we basically took some published data and tried to identify in sort of in kind of 1 meter depth increments what the expected amount of steel would need to be. What's the weight of the foundation, and then what's the cost of steel at the time to figure out how much the cost would be for the foundations themselves. And then also the transportation costs, which are going to change. There's a speed that vessels use. So as you have far longer distances, your steam time increases and costs go up accordingly. In the construction category, we also have transmission costs, both the the capital expenditures and the installation costs of cabling. What you can see here is that I have HVAC and HVDC listed. At some point, it's more cost effective to switch from AC, which would be near shore, out to DC. And so the cost, the calculus changes a little bit. There's not a set distance at which that changes, but we do vary the costs to minimize which cabling would be used. Certainly every wind farm is going to have a very unique calculation, but we tried to incorporate the fact that your cabling costs can really change over distance. Okay. And then O&M, operations and maintenance, can actually change with distance, depending on what type of support you need, whether it's onshore or offshore based support. Your costs can change per megawatt per kilometer each year. So we varied the O&M costs as well. And then average power output, we varied by using a change in capacity factors, meaning, as you get farther north and have stronger wind speeds, that the Repower 5 megawatt is going to have a higher capacity factor in some locations than others. And so you have a higher power output. So that's how we developed the levelized cost of energy model. And we come up with this map. You can represent these in lots of different ways. This is one way to represent it, where we look at, green is good, red is bad, where essentially you're taking the base cost. I'm not showing the actual LCOE dollar amounts here. I'm showing the increase in LCOE. So if we take our lowest dollar value and we increase it by certain amounts, you can see the costs go up as you move farther offshore. Okay, that makes sense for the reasons that I've just listed. And costs also go up as you move farther south, and that's primarily it's because it's cost per unit energy that the wind is not quite as strong in southern areas. Right? So you can vary this a little bit, and I've put in here some of the BOEM wind planning areas and leases that probably should be updated. I think there's some newer maps out there, but it just gives you a sense of where the wind farms might be planned and how they correspond to some of these costs. Okay, so we can build this LCOE model, right? You can just sort of input new numbers all the time and sort of update those. Then we want to look at fisheries and how they might interact. So how do we know where good fishing is? Well, there's lots of different data sets for identifying fishing effort and fishing value. None of them are perfect. We're in this model using VTR, or vessel trip reports. These are reports that any fishing vessel has to fill out at the end of the day. Where did you catch your fish? What did you catch and how much? They're really imperfect because they assign a single location on a vessel that might be moving around and catching fish in different places. So they're not perfect, but they're something that we have access to. It's a confidential data set through National Marine Fisheries Service, but you can gain access to this under certain parameters. So we looked at this VTR database and then selected species in that database that were important in the mid-Atlantic. So there's a lot of species there. There's well over 100 species that are commercially caught in the mid-Atlantic, but there's really just a few that are really valuable. So about 10 species comprise about 85% of all the landings in the mid-Atlantic. I've put some of the high value species here. It'll change kind of from year to year, which are the top, but I'm sure you recognize some that are on this list. In our analysis, we looked specifically at just the scallop industry and then the surfclam and quahog industry. And there's a few reasons why we really focused on those. It really has to do with sort of the spatial independence theory that it's very hard to say, for fish that are highly mobile, if they're moving all over the place, catching them here, you could just catch them over here next time. So we're looking at sort of sessile species and areas that are known habitat for those species that are not moving very much, okay? So we look at scallops and clams, just to give you a sense of kind of the number of trips and how much is being caught in each of these. This is sort of the data breakdown. So we're seeing a lot of trips. We do have limitations, so you shouldn't draw too much from this other than to just get a sense of what's represented in our database. There are strict limitations on both of these industries. They're both regulated industries. So I'll start with the sea scallops. This is a really high value species. More than half of the shellfish value in the mid-Atlantic is coming from scallops, even though it's not that high by weight, right? And that's because the price of scallops is really high. For any of you that eat scallops, you know that already. And there are some different access areas, specific access areas for catching scallops, and then those areas are periodically closed down to make sure that the population is growing. So there's some nuance with how we think about what the value of this industry is, right? It might appear that, you know, if you don't account for the fact that there's closures, it might look like an area is artificially less important than it really is. And so there's some nuance in looking at those data sets. Scallops are caught through a dredge, right? Clams too, actually. So you're essentially pulling this sort of chain mat across the seafloor, and it sort of embeds into the sediment. So you could think about how this might conflict with wind, because you may have cables that are buried, right? Hopefully deeper than you're dragging your scallops, but sometimes they may migrate up. Maybe they're not as deep as they once were. And then you also have the turbines structures themselves, right, as potentially conflicting, right? They could be some sort of barrier, right? So not all, but most of the scallop industry is caught in this way in the mid-Atlantic. And so there's lots of different ways to represent this data. We can look at average catch, we can look at effort. So there's lots of ways to represent this data. What we're showing here is sort of the red means this is where more of our species are caught, right? Green means there's not as many caught here. Gray means there are some species caught here, but we can't show you the data due to confidentiality restrictions. And then blank means there's no data representing scallops are caught there, right? So you can see clear trends where there's certainly aggregations, and these are averaged across a number of years. Okay. So when we take those maps, we can then say, all right, let's take like the top 90, the 90 to 100th percentile and say these are high value areas. Okay, so we can look at sort of a normalized distribution and kind of pull out the top as really high value, and then a moderate value, and then sort of a lower value. And we can assign sort of a qualitative measure to how important a geographic location as a continental shelf lease block might be to the fishing industry. Yeah, we can do that for both the scallop industry, the clam industry. You can do it for any industry. And we do that for wind too. We say, what are the high value wind areas? High value wind would be low cost, right? And then we can put those together and make some comparisons. So what you're seeing here is, anything that's in the red, right? So burgundy, red, pink is high wind value, okay? And anything that is in sort of the dark color, so either burgundy, the dark purple, or the dark blue would be very high scallop, the highest scallop value. And then I put the wind energy areas on this as well. So just at kind of a quick glance, you can see the dark areas tend to be the high conflict areas, and they don't really overlap with the existing wind energy areas in the mid-Atlantic, which is great. It's great for right now. As we think about future wind, right, once we've developed these locations and we're starting to look to the next set of offshore wind, then this might become more important consideration with scallops. Okay. So we can look at the same type of thing with clams, right? Surf clams and ocean quahogs are managed under a single ITQ fishery. That means individual transferable quota. What you really need to know is they're basically fished as one fishery. So they're also very high value, and they share some characteristics with scallops in that they're sessile. That just means they don't move much. Okay. And you can see the red areas are the areas where we find most of our clams and quahogs, and they tend to be farther north, right? So there's a different geographic area for our clams and our quahogs, which does in fact conflict a little bit more in New Jersey and off of southern New York. So these are some issues I think we may expect to see in the Atlantic shores area, for example, because you can see a direct overlap with that wind energy area. Okay. So, ultimately coming up with some, putting these tools together can help in the planning process, right? It's not, these maps aren't meant to necessarily be static, but it's meant to develop sort of a spatial model in which we can consider industries together as we're thinking about, future decision making. We don't want displaced fishers to incur costs and have reduced revenue. We also don't want to see undue restrictions on the wind industry from kind of a lack of transparency and involvement and consideration in the planning process. And we certainly have seen that, not to the fault of the wind industry or of federal government, but it's difficult to bring everybody together to identify some of these issues. So to put more context on some of the challenges between the two industries, I just wanted to share a little bit about what we're working on right now to help contextualize this. So we've been doing some interviews with fishery stakeholders starting this fall. We've done semi-structured interviews with government officials, some fisheries representatives, some people that would identify as liaisons between the two industries to really understand attitudes of the fishing community and then the intersection among the two industries. And so we found some interesting results, which may not be completely surprising, but I've tried to put some words on that were used quite often. And we are really hearing about this overwhelming feeling of kind of fear and threat from the offshore wind industry. That fishers are really concerned in a way that's become almost debilitating and has impeded inclusion in the planning process. Okay, there's a feeling among the fishing industry that offshore wind is inevitable, which is interesting because as someone who's worked on offshore wind for a number of years, we don't always feel that it's inevitable, but that was an interesting perception. And that it will result in a lack of community benefits. The fact that we're already assuming that it's a done deal means that the fishing community is not going to have, or is not going to be considered in a way that's sort of just or fair. And we heard a lot about the motives of industry, right? That there was a really questioned what their motives are, and a lack of transparency from industry, and certainly favoring land-based solutions of solar and land-based wind. Okay. But I think ultimately we can frame this in the procedural justice framework. And this is really where individuals are given a voice, right? Developers and government actions are seen as reasonable and fair. Outcomes might be more satisfying, even if it's not kind of your priority. You don't get your way every time. But procedural justice really means that we're that there's sort of a just process, right? And that what's the way that we're planning and the way that we're moving forward, even if you don't always get what you want, that you're more pleased with the outcomes. Okay. So some of the other things that came up in our interviews that sort of fit into this concept of procedural justice, or as it's perceived by the fishing industry, injustice, is that there's a lot of uncertainty about the offshore wind development process. This is really interesting because there's, I think, been a lot of effort on the government side to try to make this process transparent and streamlined. But this was noted again and again and again by our fishing stakeholders, that there's so much uncertainty about what that process is that it's become a barrier to participation. And that there's just sort of this overwhelming sense of not wanting to participate because of a lack of understanding of what this whole permitting process even is. There's also a strong perceived power inequity, which is also interesting due to certain government actions that have given more, I would say, more consideration and maybe more power to the fishing industry than we've seen in the past. But certainly the fishing industry is perceiving that there's a real power imbalance, and that the fishing community has a lot less power than other stakeholders. and that there's also a lack of transparency by developers. And so this has become a barrier to the fishing community wanting to be included in the process. And they noted over and over again that they just wanted to be asked what is most important to them. So we found that that was really interesting, and I think can help us as we're moving forward in the planning process of sort of how we're addressing offshore wind. And I think that there can be some important lessons for both academics, but also government and industry. So overall, I will just say, I think, the social and some of the regulatory challenges are really the barriers right now for the US offshore wind industry. It's not to say that the technological challenges aren't important, they are, but they're probably not going to hold up the industry the same way that we're currently seeing. And if we can develop some models to help assess, different industries at the same time, it can help us make better decisions and maybe provide more transparency and opportunities for inclusion for the fishing industry. And so if we can reduce some of our social conflict, hopefully we'll have a greater likelihood of implementation of the wind industry, which can help us meet our net zero carbon emissions goals by 2050. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Alison, for a great presentation, a great seminar. Before we get into questions, just real quick, you can share your slides with us, I'm assuming. There were a couple of requests in the chat for folks who were very interested in having your slides.
Oh, okay. Some of these are under development for publishing right now, so there may be a few that I take out, but okay. Yes, I can share 98% of them.
Okay, great. And then Kevin, I guess we could probably put that on the REI website. I will put a link in the chat to the REI page. And to kick off the questions, if we don't mind, I saw there was one from Alan Roebuck in the chat, and it was actually related to one I was going to ask. So Alan, if you don't mind, I'm just going to merge that together with one question to kick us off. And I already see a couple hands raised. The question is about climate change, and the ocean is changing, the climate is changing. Alan points out, how do you account for changing winds, currents, hurricanes? And in relation to that, I'll add the change in fisheries, right? Fish are moving north as the ocean warms, different species are in different areas, and these wind projects are going to last 25, 30 years. How do we account for that in these kinds of discussions?
That's like the $1 million question. I think about that a lot.
I figured.
I think we need to build, so actually, this is what I really think. I think we need to build better models where we're building in habitat change models into this type of forward thinking planning. The issue is those are really complicated models. We don't have a great understanding of what species are going to move where. So I think we're sort of at like a chicken or egg scenario where we can say, well, we don't have enough information. And in fact, I hear this in the fishing industry a lot. Like, we know that fisheries are changing, so we can't make decisions for the future based on today. But if we don't know what it's going to look like in 25 years, then we're just impeding any sort of progress that we have. But I do think that we can apply habitat models to try to get a better understanding of what we might expect to see in the future. But I think it's really challenging because that is certainly used as an argument against kind of any new development, right? We can't put something that's going to last for 25 years in the ocean because we don't know what it's going to conflict with in the future, right? So I don't have the best answer other than I think we need to have good habitat models that we could, ideally merge. I don't think we have those yet. I don't think that's a future study area that my collaborators and I have talked about including, and we haven't done that yet, but I think that is a really logical next step. I think that right now, climate change is urgent. We have to address it now. We can't wait 10 more years until we have better models to start saying, okay, now that we know, this is where we should put the turbines. Climate change is urgent, and you all know that. So I think we need to move forward. So some of this I think needs to be messaging, not just messaging, but collaborative processes with the industries that are sharing these concerns. If we're seeing a slight northern march of different species, right, which we know we are, then, asking fisheries to have the fishing community to have input about, future development, I think will go a long way. These wind energy areas that were noted on the maps were largely put forth by government before there was a lot of consultation with the stakeholders. And it's hard, once you draw those lines on a map, it's hard to undraw them. So I think before we move into sort of our next phase, I don't think we're going to undraw the wind energy areas that we've already designed, but I think as we're thinking about the next phase of wind development, which we will get to, we can be a little bit more proactive and inclusive in the process.
Thank you. I think we'll start with David Hughes. I see your hand up, and I saw you in the chat. Oh, sure. Go ahead, Alan. Sorry.
Hi. I was wondering, just how do you account for climate change when you're calculating how much it will cost? How will the winds change? How will the currents change? How will the frequency of hurricanes change, even without the fish?
Yeah, thanks for that question. We've not included that yet into this model. Right now, it doesn't account for that. I think that if you could incorporate how you might expect wind speeds to change, you could put that into the model and adjust your capacity factors. We have not done that based on anything in the future, though. But perhaps I would love for this to be a conversation if we had maps that looked at or that identified what we expect wind speed to be in different locations in 10 years, that would be an incredibly valuable data set.
Thank you. And actually, that's something I'd like to look at a little bit more too. We're going to go with David Hughes first, and then I think we'll go Daphne next. But Daphne, you've had your hand up for a while. So David, if you want to start, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, thank you. That was a fascinating talk. I work on onshore wind and public opposition in Spain, so I was fascinated to hear about the offshore. My question really comes back to the phrase "just transition" in your title. I wonder how you define it. It's being increasingly linked up to energy democracy and public ownership. And offshore wind, by its very nature, seems to be quite far away from those things. The fishermen, for them, it seems to be a question of how much they lose in terms of this wind farm. It doesn't seem to be any potential for them to get direct benefits. I mean, of course, saving the conditions for life on planet Earth is a benefit, but in terms of direct benefits from this wind farm, it's just a question of whether they lose big or lose little or stay even. So it's understandable that they would be cynical about the whole thing and withdraw the social license they give it by not participating. So I wonder if not participating is a form of protest. And then my second question is about the capital intensity. I mean, you go offshore and you end up with these huge, gigantic turbines, which are so capital intensive. And so the corporate capture and concentration of the offshore space is even worse than the onshore space. So I wonder if there's any way that you can have a democratic energy system that is responsive to and controlled by communities when it's offshore.
Those are great questions. Thank you, David. I think with the just transition here, I think it's not just about the losses. I think it's also about the potential ways that fisheries could be involved in the process. So there is the potential for ownership. I think that when you look at some different ownership options, it's a lot more complicated with offshore wind, where you need a really large wind farm to hit your bottom line, right? You're not going to have these sort of one-offs very often. So I think when fishers are talking about community benefits and what those might be, rather than just minimizing losses, although I do agree that that's sort of the framing often, there's also, I think this concept of compensation comes up a lot. And I'm not sure that really hits sort of the justice and equity piece, but it's certainly part of it. And compensation has been discussed quite widely with the fishing industry. At first, there was a lot of opposition to compensation because fishing community doesn't inherently own the ocean or the rights to fish the fish, right? They belong to all of us. These are the commons. So compensation measures, I think, are going to be voluntary among industry and fishing communities. And what those compensation measures might be could potentially be ownership roles. Some of our fishing communities are not necessarily like one-off boats owned by, it's not just like a single lobsterman with one boat. Like some of these fishing groups are very highly organized, and I think there is the potential for there could be an ownership option, there could be direct payments, there could be support in accessing, fishing licenses or other barriers to entry to maintain the fishing industry. So that's where I see sort of some of the benefits coming up. And that's not something that I've really talked about in this presentation. I've talked more about the procedural side in increasing access into the planning. And you're right, I think that the non-participation is what we have seen happen for probably 10 years now. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And it is one way to protest. But what has happened is it's sort of come back to bite because the planning process moved forward anyway. And then those lines got drawn on maps that are hard to undraw. And so I think that we're starting to see an increased interest in participation, but there's different needs among the different factions of fishing communities, and the needs are not all the same. So that gets a little bit of sort of how we're thinking about kind of the justice, but I do agree. I can't completely remember the second part of your question, other than it was that you're talking about sort of these capital intensive projects.
Whether the offshore space could ever be made democratic or wind.
Yeah, I mean, one of the projects that I referenced called Fisherman's Energy, which was off of Atlantic City, was a Fisher-owned project. It didn't move forward. There are a number of reasons for that, but I do think that there could be the potential. Right now we're seeing a trend of developers, kind of international developers that have a lot of experience with the wind industry that are sort of buying out the leases that are owned by some of our smaller or local companies because they have the ability to develop these wind farms. But I don't think it has to be that way forever. I think that that's probably what's going to happen in the first 10 years while we kick off this industry and costs keep coming down. I think wind in general, it's more difficult to have these sort of community-based projects that are, solar. It's a lot easier to have solar that way because you can have smaller projects. You don't need quite as much capital infrastructure to meet your bottom line. But I do think that moving forward and maybe our next phase after we get through, right now we don't even really have an industry yet in the US, right? We're still sort of trying to get over that hurdle. I think that once we're a little more established and maybe one of these large projects actually gets built, we're going to see more opportunities for different finance, more creative financing and ownership options. So yeah, I do think it's possible, but it's probably not going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years.
Thanks. I know some people may have to go because it's 12, but are you good to stick around for a few more minutes? Because I know there's quite a few more questions that folks had. Daphne, it looks like you took your hand down. I don't know if you had to go, but if you are still there, Daphne, do you want to ask?
I'm here.
Hi, Daphne.
Hi. I took my hand down so that it wasn't still raised. Alison, thank you for joining us today. I had a question more about your project and how you made decisions on what your levels were for both the clam and the scallop. So you had high, medium, and low kind of values to each of those grid squares. Mm-hmm. Why did you put a different percentile level between clams and scallops? Because it seems that the clam map would look a little different if it had the same percentile cutoffs.
It does. They do look different. You're right. And this is one way that maps can be really misleading. We did it based on histograms, actually. Okay. And so we looked where there were natural breaks in the data. We played with this a lot to try to figure out, so we tried sort of forcing it at the same levels, but it was, that felt artificial, even though it made sense on paper, because there weren't natural breaks right there. So we looked where there was sort of clusterings and we made our breaks that way. But that certainly will change what your maps look like. I do agree with that.
Yeah, cool. Also, just as a point of conversation, I am very fortunate to work with the clam and scallop industries here, and asking all kinds of fun questions with their cooperation with respect to wind energy and some of these interactions and displacement issues that you're talking about. So you're right, it's a very real conversation. My sense from my experience has been that these fishing folks have been very engaged in the process. They haven't walked away from the table. They haven't kind of done that protest sort of strategy. They've put a lot of time into being engaged on the research side and on the conversations that are active. So I think there's a lot more to the story, and that I'm happy to follow up, but just wanted to kind of float that out there. My experience has largely been with the clam and scallop industry folks. I don't know much more about other sectors. So,
yeah, thank you for that. And I should clarify, what I was sharing sort of at the end of my presentation, really, we're talking with a lot of the lobster industry in the Gulf of Maine, where there's emerging projects that are really controversial, and there's a high degree of concern, and there has been some of this where people are sort of talking about not wanting to be engaged. There's also access issues of engagement, right? Where meetings are not always accessible. But I do agree with you. I think the Block Island project in Rhode Island would not have moved forward if it wasn't for really dedicated involvement of the fishing industry. Yeah, and I didn't mean to insinuate that the fishing community has sort of walked away from the process. I think it's more that it's been maybe they haven't been given enough opportunity to engage in the way that they would like to in the decision making that happens before they're presented with squares on a map, which is really, really difficult.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, thank you, Daphne. Appreciate that.
I'm gonna try to merge two questions from the chat together from Simi Payne and Rachel Manhard, just kind of maybe adding a little bit more complexity to everything, I guess. But question from Rachel was on identifying general high conflict areas across all fishing sectors. And then to add to that, Simi mentions, what about other species that aren't necessarily fisheries related, like migratory birds, endangered right whales, things like that? Are there plans to incorporate all of those kinds of areas into the effort?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so I would say that the way that we started looking at fisheries in general was to say, let's look at all the different fisheries and sort of lump them together and look at them sort of in a non-discrete way. And I think that's been problematic because the different fisheries operate in really different ways. So I do think it's important to look at these issues by fishery. Could you merge these with other species? Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, we did a lot of work looking at some mobile and highly mobile species. It's complicated to do that because of the fact that these fish move and you can catch them in different locations. They don't have this sort of spatial independence. And so I think it's a little more complicated building that in, but you certainly could. And we have experimented with some methodologies. I don't think that we have a great method down for doing that yet, which is why we haven't included the highly mobile species. It felt a little disingenuous. You can definitely do this with some of the other species that you care about. We don't have plans to do this right away. I do think that would be a logical extension, is identifying like important habitat areas. We certainly have those on maps. We know where there are important areas for right whales, roseate terns, whatever the species of concern may be. So you certainly could do this. It's not something that we have in the works right now.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Tom Dameron, if you're still there, I think you're still there. If you want to ask your question, or I could ask based on your chat, if you'd like. If you're not there, Tom, I'll just ask it here. So Tom had asked, like he sees that he saw the mapping of the wind and the species, and the question he asks is, What about the spatial operational needs of those industries? So the fishing industry, for example, take a clamming boat. They need a certain area in which to maneuver their boats, right? Can you account for that kind of stuff in the process as well?
Yeah, you can. We have not built that in, but you definitely could. You could build in a certain distance around every catch location if you wanted to. So I think that it's not something I've actually thought about incorporating. That's a great question. I mean, I've thought about it in the sense of like a pair trawl versus like a single, like a scallop vessel, right? How they have very different operational needs. And then certainly active fishing versus transit. You know, the like transit lanes are not really accounted for in this. But I think that you could build that in if you knew what those operational needs were and you had a sense of what the you could probably find out what the distance would need to be for safe operating for turn radius, for example, that you could build that in and possibly extend out those high value areas a little bit bigger based on how much more space you would need.
So
Thank
Joseph,
you. Tom, you there? Oh, there you are.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I was on Bluetooth and I had trouble switching over. So the spatial operational needs really doesn't have anything to do with turning radius, but more to do with the spatial needs that is necessary to actually fish. So, you know, fishing's not like trucking where you go to a spot, you pick up a product and you turn around and you come back in. There's searching that is a very big part of fishing, and then there's changes in conditions during a trip. You could be working, 10-mile-an-hour northerly wind, and the wind comes around to the southwest, and you have to totally change the way you're towing by 90 degrees or so, and tow in a different direction just to continue harvesting. So these are really big considerations when we're looking at the distance between turbines and what is actually the spatial operational needs of a fishery.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Thank you for that, Tom. Do you have suggestions of how to better implement that quantitatively into a model? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. So the surfclam and ocean quahog industry has actually done quite a few analysis around this topic that I'd be glad to send you. So we actually used the vessel monitoring service, the VMS data, which we have access to, on a much finer scale. And if you're interested in doing studies with that VMS data, I'm sure that we could get that available to other analysis.
That would be great. We have not had access to the VMS data, so that would be great. Yeah, let's follow up after this meeting.
Okay, very good.
I appreciate your comments.
I've got your email address here. I'll reach out.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Tom. Ben, you're still there. He asked the question about how offshore wind development might hinder ocean transportation. Ben, feel free to chime in if you want, if you're still, actually, I don't know if he's still there. But if you want, you can still answer that, Alison. And I'm looking through if there's any other questions too. That a lot came scrolling by.
Okay. I guess you're talking about shipping. I'm presuming you're talking about shipping for transportation. I don't know. I'm just going to go with that since the person who asked the question is not here. The easy way is we've basically said, okay, there's, we have shipping lanes. We stay away from the shipping lanes by a certain distance. The Coast Guard has given us guidance on how far wind farms need to be from shipping lanes. That's like the quick and easy question. There was a study that was done a few years ago looking at what it would cost to move the habitual shipping patterns, which are not shipping lanes, but where the vessels tend to go, what it would cost society to move those, let's say 20 miles further offshore, right? So that we can build wind turbines closer to shore and minimize costs for all the different costs that go into the category. And it was found that, you know, there's some cost to society, potentially increased pollution from steaming, you know, farther offshore, increasing distance, but even accounting for kind of the climate and the pollution issues and the additional time on the ocean, there's massive gains to society for moving vessel transit farther offshore to allow the wind industry to be built a little closer in. So certainly not what the marine transportation industry might be most interested in doing, but certainly for if you're looking at benefits to society, it's certainly the analyses that I've seen, although I have not conducted them myself, seem to indicate that yes, there are potentially going to be conflicts of that coastwise transit along the Atlantic coast, and that if we move it, right, if we say, well, I'm sorry, we understand that this is where you like to go, but we're going to build a wind farm here, and now you're going to go over here, that there can be large, multi-billions in benefits to society over the lifespan of a wind farm. So I don't know if that answered the question, but that's what, since we don't know what I guess the original intent was, that's what I got for you.
Thank you.
Sure.
There's certainly lots of complications with everything here, right? It's not an easy issue for anybody.
Right.
And we're coming up on 12:15. If there's anyone out there who wants to ask one last question, feel free to unmute or whatnot. Otherwise, I'm just watching here to see if anyone else unmutes. Nope, it looks like that's it for now. Well, I want to thank you again for being here and for presenting your seminar today. It was great to see you. It's been a while. It's funny that, so I mentioned in my introduction that Alison's at UMass Amherst, and I actually gave a seminar there just before COVID. That was the last trip I did before COVID hit. So I haven't seen her since then. But in any case, thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Alison. When you can send the slides that you can share, please do, and we'll get them posted. And thank you everybody for joining us. So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for inviting me. And great questions. Really appreciate those.
We've always got a good group here, so I'm glad we were able to engage with a lot of the good questions. So thanks everybody for joining us.